So, speaking of humility, you will notice that in the previous lecture, some of my slides still had like template content on them. I apologize for that. That's the challenge when we do this live. We don't have any cuts. We are just riffing. We are teaching. So I apologize for that. If you want that slide content, again, drop me an email. But I talked about it, and we're going to dive deeper into some of those limitations in this week's or in this next module. So. Here we are again with our friend qualitative analysis techniques. So now we're expanding on the coding that we discussed about and kind of, like I said, getting our hands dirty and diving deeper into what this process actually looks like. So really, this is the central challenge of qualitative research, right? How do we transform hundreds of individual coding decisions, and there will be hundreds, into meaningful research findings, right? How are we translating these complex ideas? And this is the difference between data processing and actual analyses, right? So we can think about the scope of work ahead as, a typical environmental justice study might have 50 interviews, mine had 40. Could have 20 policy documents, various reports. That's potentially thousands of pages of text that are going to need this systematic analysis, right? So the techniques that we're going to learn today are really going to determine whether this data becomes meaningful insights or just a descriptive document and a pile of data. So poor technique is going to produce research that simply lists complaints without explaining patterns. And I'm going to talk about that's boring qualitative research. But sophisticated analysis reveals how justice operates systematically across different contexts. And that's typically our goal of these studies, right? So today we're going to work through actual coding decisions using some data that I have made up. It's not real, but we're going to say it's like real from marine conservation research, right? So it's not real, but I've simulated some data. I came up with some quotes that I think you might hear. Just got to see what this might look like in actual practice. So let's see. By the end of today, you will know how to move from individual codes to systematic patterns and analytical insights. Okay. So we are back here at the analytical challenge, right? And so with this process, we discussed the theoretical frameworks, right? And we discussed moving from that theoretical framework of the five dimensions of environmental justice to the next phase, which is the empirical evidence, right? So we're going to move from these individual codes that we've created and start looking for patterns, right? And this is really where analytical rigor is going to come in and determine the research credibility and how relevant this is going to be. And we're going to use a case study on coral reef conservation as a demonstration throughout, right? So the first step in this, framework analysis process of actually getting into the data is familiarization, right? So we talked about, right, we had a deductive coding approach. We have these environmental justice dimensions that are going to be, the five prongs of our framework. But then as we get in, we need to familiarize ourselves with the data. So you need to immerse yourself in the full data set. You want to avoid bringing premature conclusions or assumptions in. So you need to read. You need to read these interviews. Just read them, right? Take notes. Don't come in ready to code. Just familiarize yourself. Listen to the transcripts. If you're doing your interviews and you're actually transcribing what people said, this is a great way to listen to them multiple times and get yourself really familiar with what's being discussed. Okay, what am I hearing, right? And we're going to talk about keeping memos throughout. This is a great start to just get a research journal. Everybody loves a fresh notebook. Crack that fresh notebook out. Just start taking notes as you're listening, right? You're going to start looking for recurring themes, surprises, and you're going to ask yourself constantly this thing related to what is it called? Positionality. What am I bringing to this data? What baggage am I bringing to this data? Not baggage necessarily, but what parts of myself, my assumptions am I bringing, right? So this is next stage is going to be the sort of thematic framework development, right? And we already have one for our example, okay, that we talked about with human elephant conflicts. But this is where you would really start setting up the coding within that framework. And again, we need to stay open to new themes that might emerge from the data. But the critical question during this familiarization is, how am I going to start sorting these codes that make sense to me throughout the process, right? So, during familiarization with, for instance, the marine conservation data, you could, discover that fishing communities are expressing genuine concern for marine conservation. This might be a surprise, right? This may contradict a typical assumption or a biased characterization that these resource users oppose conservation, right? So this is where this important sort of, I didn't expect that sort of comes to be, and you're testing your research questions and your hypotheses, right? If you don't have them developed yet, this is where you can start developing those, but you should have these developed at this point. Research questions and hypotheses is another topic of another lecture. So the key decision is going to be balancing that deductive coding with your predetermined categories with this idea of inductive coding, staying open to those new patterns, okay? And the Ritchie and Spencer method of this sort of framework analysis is can be broken down in these sort of five steps. So again, we talked about familiarization, developing that coding framework. Ours is deductive. We've already got a pretty good idea of some broad categories. We're going to start doing some coding in that third part after we have that framework development. We're going to start looking at how those codes are shaping up and start categorizing those. And then we're going to start mapping, comparing, identifying themes, making some visualizations so we can really get in and unpack that data. Okay. So I'm gonna give you kind of a live coding demonstration, but I'm just gonna kind of walk through some examples and show you like how we would do this, right? So here is an interview excerpt from a fisher in Indonesia. This individual said, "The marine protected area will protect the reef. This is good, but my family has fished these waters for 4 generations. Now they tell us we cannot fish where the best catch is. The tourism boats will come instead. Rich people from Jakarta will benefit. Well, we must find new fishing grounds, right? So let's code this together, right? What distributive justice elements do you see here? Right. So let me see if I can get yes. Let me get a little pin here, right? So I see some here, right? I see a mention of we cannot fish where the best catch is. That's loss of access. So we could code that as DISTLOSS, right? Wow, that is the worst handwriting I've ever seen in my life. Let me erase that. Let me go back. Let me erase that. Can I get the eraser? Here we go. Okay, can I make this smaller? More fine point? Okay, let's just say loss. All right, so we'll be coding that, right? So this again is where do we see this? We said we cannot fish where the best catch is, right? We see distributive justice right there. Rich people from Jakarta will benefit. I see what could be external benefit capture, right? So we have this here will benefit while others must find new fishing grounds. This could be dist external, right? You could just put dist x, right? We must find new fishing grounds. That could be another additional cost imposed. You could put dist cost here, okay? And right, we're only really looking at distributional codes, right? We're already like developing quite a lot of codes here, okay? So this individual also says the MPA will protect the reef. This is good. This isn't simple opposition to conservation, right? It's a complex attitude about who benefits and who bears costs, right? So this individual supports conservation goals, but experiences distributional injustices in their implementation, right? This is why the careful coding matters. You can see how this is, surfacing analysis that might be missed. This complexity might be missed in a sort of in a broad strokes pass, right? So you would maybe want to make a note of that. Be like, interesting trend here. I see, this taking place, etc. Okay. So for the procedural justice coding example, let's tackle maybe a more challenging example. So this comes from a marine conservation expert or like a official on the Marine Conservation Plan. And they said, extensive stakeholder consultation was conducted through village meetings and focus groups. Community input was incorporated into zoning decisions where feasible, given scientific and legal constraints, right? Hmm, okay. How do we code this, right? So what do we think? I hear some different things within this interview, right? Let me show you why this is tricky. So at a surface reading, we see extensive consultation, right? Extensive stakeholder consultation. Okay, looks like procedural inclusion. Okay, consultation occurred. Check that box, right? Now, remember we talk about critical reading. Let's go to a critical reading of that, right? What does this individual mention that is interesting and stands out here? Where feasible, given constraints and scientific, or where feasible given scientific and legal constraints, right? Hmm. This suggests maybe there were some predetermined limitations, okay? But we need more evidence. We can't just sort of make that claim right away. We have to look at what community members said about these meetings, okay? And then we can see that, let's say there's another data source hypothetically. I don't know if I actually included that here. Let's see. Is this one recognition? They invited us? No, so let's say there's another data source that they said they invited us to meetings, but when we tried to explain fish behavior, right? So now we've moved from to another interview. They invited us to meetings when we tried to explain fish behavior patterns. The official said this wasn't scientific data, right? Okay. We identified that in this interview, right? Now we can go back to this other one and we can actually say that this is actually procedural tokenism here. Okay. You see how there's like a weaving narrate, like a weaving sort of narrative here, and we have to come back and forth through interviews to sometimes get the narrative that's being discussed. So, policy language, this sort of technical jargon can obscure power dynamics. It's very important to consider. And we need these multiple data sources to really understand exactly what happened. Okay. Recognitional justice complexity, right? So recognitional justice presents unique analytical challenges when you're coding it, right? So here's a marine biologist talking about local knowledge. Local fishers have valuable observations about fish behavior, but they lack systematic data collection. We can't base conservation decisions on observations. We have scientific surveys and statistical analyses. Hmm. Okay, how would we code this, right? Is this a recognitional justice? They said they have valuable observations, or is this an injustice, right? So we see that there is a partial recognitional acknowledgement, right? That they devalue the traditional knowledge, which is, an epistemic violation. So you could say recognitional partial, reco partial, or then also add another highlight to that same segment, reco episteme, right? Reco epistemic violence or epistemic violation. This is a clear example of privileging scientific uh, data over traditional knowledge systems. Okay, you could also say reco institution, which is institutional requirements for particular evidence types. So it's quite complex, right? It's not clearly unjust, but it recognizes like a clear, genuine tension between different knowledge systems, right? And our job as researchers is to document these tensions without taking sides prematurely. Okay. Again, this is where we're doing our best to stay neutral and simple observers. Not always possible, but we're trying, right? So, how are we going to code knowledge system conflicts without prejudging epistemological debates? Well, the marine biologist acknowledges traditional knowledge, but considers it inadequate for policy, right? This is a clear reflection of institutional constraints requiring scientific evidence types that we need to pay attention to in these interviews and continue to seek additional evidence to validate, okay? This is where data triangulation comes in, right? Data triangulation took place in a few of those examples that I just gave, where somebody mentioned something, we look for that again in another interview, right? So we're using multiple data sources to strengthen our analysis, right? So in this example, right, the issue is tourism benefit distribution in the marine protected area, right? So we have one data source of a fisher interviewing, reporting that tourism jobs are going to outsiders, okay? Another data source, tourism operators are mentioning permits or you look at permits, right? And you see that, okay, operator permits show that there are some Jakarta-based companies, which is outside this community. Data source number three, local government budgets show where tourism revenue is being allocated, right? So you can start to connect the dots there. And then you can look for a fourth data source. NGO reports are documenting community employment programs, right? Now, this is like a perfect world scenario. This is like a really clear and clean data trail. Is this going to always be the case? Absolutely not, right? So if we're looking for this, though, we need to think about, okay, where could I get this evidence to validate and triangulate my claims, right? It's going to give us what we call convergent evidence, right? And in this example, we might see that tourism benefits do flow primarily to external operators, but complexity, some revenue returns to communities through programs and training, right? So we can't completely make a claim that all the revenue is going to outsiders, right? Another triangulation finding, right? Tourism is creating unequal benefit distribution, but the pattern is more complex than just external exploitation, right? A single data source is going to present perhaps a partial perspective, okay? Triangulation is going to reveal these nuances that these individual sources might miss, right? This is why having more data in a qualitative analysis is so critical, okay? Because a reviewer or somebody may come for you and say like, well, you only looked at this one thing. How can you make that assumption? Did you even look at these reports, etc.? This complexity is going to make our analysis stronger, not weaker, because it reflects how environmental justice actually is working and functioning in practice. Okay. So some common pitfalls and solutions to coding, right? So let me share some of the most common mistakes that I see and I even make myself, right? Overcoding everything as just as relevant, right? So coding every mention of environmental impact as ecological justice, right? We should actually, and you might do this in your first pass, and you might go, oh my gosh, you look at your totals and you're like, my gosh, what was I thinking? Now I've got to go back and sort of trim these out, or actually just start over and aim for more concise codes, right? So we might look for only coding statements that make actual justice claims about environmental protection. Okay. Again, this is why having those established research questions and hypotheses is so important before you start this process. I mean, of course, the data can help you maybe recalibrate your research questions and your hypotheses, but having that clear as your study goal will really help you determine what should actually be coded, what is actually relevant. And let me tell you from experience, coding everything mistakenly can become a nightmare. Okay, so let's always try to avoid this. Again, work with advisors, colleagues, check your code book, try to code with multiple people. This is how you can avoid some of this. Pitfall number two is forcing data into these predetermined categories, right? We already talked about this, but if your data is revealing new patterns that are not fitting your framework, don't ignore them. Create new codes. Be open to new codes. If the code is like strange, doesn't fit within the framework, it's okay. Make a bucket. Start putting some codes in that bucket, right? Start seeing how this is going to shape up in the end. It's a learning experience. Pitfall three, confirmation bias, right? Only noticing evidence that's going to support your initial expectations, right? Research is not the purpose of research, purpose of qualitative data analysis is not to prove your research question right or wrong, right? We're seeing what's surfacing from the data based on our hypotheses, based on our framework, based on our theory, right? Look for disconfirming evidence. That's good. Cases that are going to contradict your emerging patterns are analytically valuable. It's not a crisis point, okay? Look for that contradictory evidence. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. Losing narrative context by treating codes as isolated fragments. Woof, this is really hard to avoid. Individual statements are always embedded in larger stories and conflicts, okay? Good analysis is going to maintain connection between coded segments and broader narrative patterns. We can't just, yeah, we're going to have some great quotes. You should save those great quotes. You should copy and paste those and put them in a doc called great quotes. But there's larger narrative patterns at play here. And that was what this triangulation example is really showing, right? If we get hooked on a, oh my gosh, I saw somebody mention that there is, money just completely flowing out of the community, we might let that kind of hook us and pull us into another direction than what the data is actually showing. So, this is where building evidence for the claim or any claims that you're going to make is vitally important, right? So let's say that we are seeing in the data a claim that marine conservation reproduces unequal power relationships, right? Or MPA zoning is reproducing colonial conservation patterns, right? You're kind of seeing this show up. This is a strong claim. It's an interesting claim, but it's very strong, right? So what evidence do we need to support it? Again, I talk to all of my students about this because when you're writing a paper, it doesn't matter what it's for, right? Even if it's like a simple literature review or like a case study or just a report, right? You're going to make like a bold claim about something, you better have evidence to back it up, a citation or something, right? But here, right, this is from an interview, so we need to we're like citing our own work within the data. Okay, we're looking to support this claim within the data, right? So what evidence do we need to support it, right? So we can look for pattern evidence, right? This could be similar outcomes across multiple cases, right? We're seeing a similar trend. We're seeing similar words. We're seeing similar experiences mentioned. We can also look for mechanistic evidence, right? This might be a very clear process that is linking causes to outcomes, like a cause and effect or causal data. This can be a little bit more rare in qualitative data, but it's not impossible, right? Counter evidence, right? This may be alternative explanations and contradictory cases. Remember, this is not bad news. This is important. This is, helping us validate. Or it could be theoretical evidence, right? It could be connection to these broader scholarly frameworks that you should be exceptionally familiar with as you're doing this qualitative analysis. You should have, already been within the literature, familiar with the literature, having perhaps even a literature review ready to fall back on, notes, guidance, and you can go back and say, this sounds like a theory that I'm familiar with. Let me search into this a little bit more. So in our marine conservation example, we can sort of use this pattern of, let's say that there is MPA zoning is reproducing colonial conservation patterns. Okay, let's triangulate this, right? So we see, okay, a pattern. There's external control We see that there's, external entities looking to control this. There's local exclusion, people mentioning constantly they're being excluded, and they're not seeing the benefits, right? So, okay, that's interesting. We're getting somewhere. Let's see if we can find any mechanistic, causality or any mechanistic, causal claims here. So we see scientific expertise constantly mentioning, privileging that over traditional knowledge through institutional requirements, right? Well, our funders require us to do it this way, right? We can't just like take the local communities, knowledge and use that in our grants, right? This is like, okay, so this is institutionalized, right? Counter evidence, right? Well, some local employment and capacity building efforts are taking place. So we can't, say this is concrete, right? But then we can think about, what about environmental colonialism and some, decolonial studies and let's get into some conservation governance literature and see if there's actually a phenomenon for this or actually other people who have noticed this, right? So we're looking, we acknowledge the counter evidence rather than ignoring it, and we're strong analysis, is engaging with this complexity rather than oversimplifying it, right? We're not just looking to confirm things. We're looking to find evidence, keep some open questions. We're sort of mapping these themes as we go. Analytical memos are really a critical component of this and really crucial for developing this thinking throughout the coding process, right? So an analytical memo is going to be something within your research journal, or it could be within the software you use, but you're going to interpret, or I'm sorry, you're going to document these interpretive decisions and emerging patterns, right? You're going to write these things down because you may conduct this analysis in January and you might get to writing the paper in May. You're not going to remember this sort of thought process that you were working through, right? So, analytical memos are crucial to go back and be like, where was my head when I was reading that? Or what thought process was I in? Or you're seeing this emerge again and you're thinking, I saw this in the past. Let me go back to, this note, 3 weeks ago. I did see this, right? Okay, let's start triangulating this data, okay? A good memo is going to include as much of your coding decisions and reasoning as possible, right? Mentioning the patterns you're noticing across data sources, showing those connections to theoretical concepts. You could draw these even, right? Questions to further analysis, right? I should look into this, or this is interesting. Maybe we should explore this more, right? Here's a sample memo, right, that you could do. So let's say we see like code dist intergenerational, right? Distributive intergenerational, right? And I could write, well, fishers are emphasizing 4 generations of family fishing in these waters. Patterns across interviews are showing this, right? There's a historical precedent used to justify current access claims. I know that I'm seeing some sort of theoretical connection. There's a lot of mention of traditional property rights versus state conservation authority. I've seen this mentioned in some of the conservation literature, some of the land tenure literature I've read, some of the governance and policy, political ecology. Um, I have a question that I want to look more into. Like, how are these intergenerational claims interacting with conservation goals? Right. This is interesting. We should explore this more. Right. See how I'm taking this. Of course, it's not a perfect example, right? But see how this memo is documenting my reasoning, right? I'm identifying some patterns, trying to sort of reflect on some theoretical connections that could require more reading, and then I'm generating some additional questions that might be beyond my research questions, right? So these memos are going to transform your coding from like a mechanical categorization into this actual analytical thinking exercise, which is the entire strength of this approach. Okay. So write memos throughout your coding process. I don't care if it sounds silly. I don't care if it seems weird. You have to get in the habit of it if you're going to do this kind of research, right? You cannot write these at the end. You have to write these as you do the research. Trust me on this. These memos become the foundation of your analytical insights, your theoretical contributions, your discussion section of your manuscript. It's incredibly vital, okay? Oh, fun. Intercoder reliability. So, not my favorite. Not my favorite topic, but important, and contested within qualitative research, right? So, what is this? Intercoder reliability is how you're going to address challenges in coding consistency, right? So, in the scientific process, in scientific research, right, we are trying to make claims that are supported by the most amount of evidence, and we're trying to remove bias, and we're trying to ensure the decisions we are making are systematic, and we're not just over here like wimbly nimbly observing like strange phenomenon and calling it theory, right? So, justice research involves interpretive judgment, though. This makes this difficult. Different researchers might code the same statement differently. They almost 100% will do that, right? And in these sort of theoretical, heady, different interpretation, contested ideas, these traditional reliability measures like Cohen's kappa or percent absolute agreement that you might see in more quantitative studies or some more like statistical measurements of agreement. These measures might penalize more sophisticated thinking in qualitative data that recognizes complexity. And there's a whole other discussion to be had about epistemology and more folks who are related to like the hard sciences rather than social science, people who don't understand qualitative data analysis. That's a whole nother rabbit hole that we could get into in office hours. But this is difficult, right? And as you are working to mitigate this from the get-go, the better off you are, right? So I recommend, and what I typically focus on is interpretive consistency, right? Instead of just measuring, okay, hey, we agree, right? If I'm doing this review with somebody else or a team, right? We compare our reasoning processes, okay? Not just, oh, how many codes did we get? Or how many times did we code this the same way, right? Did we use similar analytical logic, right? So did we identify compatible patterns, even when individual coding decisions differ, right? This involves iterative collaboration and understanding and can be completely contextual based on the specific study, the specific location, right? But the goal is to come to a agreed upon shared understanding through this discussion of how you're going to overcome these interpretive challenges and to maintain as carefully as possible analytical consistency that is documented so that you can sufficiently show evidence of pattern identification while preserving that iterative and interpretive sophistication, right? That's probably like you're like, oh, too much, right? But it's just really important to think about this is, this really comes in when you're dealing with complex social phenomena like environmental justice. And you really have to think carefully about this. I think this is one of the most fun and most challenging parts of doing qualitative and justice-driven research. Um, I'll try to incorporate some more of this into some future lectures to kind of add more color and explanation for you, but it's difficult, right? It really does just come down to kind of what's going on within the given study and case. So we are moving then from codes to claims, right? So we are going to talk about the progression of where we're going to take all these codes and we're actually start putting these into those claims, like I mentioned, these theoretical or analytical claims, right? So individual codes are going to document our specific observations, right? These coded patterns are going to identify then the systematic relationships. Themes are going to develop into broader analytical concepts, and then theoretical claims are going to connect back to scholarly debates. Thank you. That is the life cycle of qualitative social science. So here's an example, a marine conservation example, right? So here's an example. Code could be distributive external, procedural exclusion, and recognitional devalue, right? So could be a pattern here. Systematic community marginalization, despite participatory rhetoric, could be causing problems, right? Procedural inclusion without substantive influence, well established within the literature and critiques of conservation, right? So this theory then may challenge assumptions about participatory governance effectiveness, right? It's not just enough to have the workshop. We have to be sure that we're actually giving people a meaningful voice and a seat at the table, right? So each level requires more abstract thinking while maintaining that empirical grounding, right? This is practice. This comes with time. This progression distinguishes sophisticated research from simple descriptive research, right? And there's a place for descriptive research, but in this space of justice-driven research, environmental justice, qualitative social science, right? We're not just looking to say, you know, distributive injustice is taking place here, and 400 people said it was happening, and it looks like they're not getting payments. Book closed, right? It's not the strongest research contribution. We're not really building new theoretical insights about how environmental justice is operating in practice, right? Distributional harms, as we mentioned, distributional justice, well established within the space of thinking and philosophy and applied sciences and environmental justice and political ecology and economy and all kinds of other different disciplines, right? So, what are we bringing to the table? What's unique? Okay, so this analytical progression is, I sort of outline this here in this sort of flow diagram, and an example from the choral distribution is here. Sorry, that was repetitive. So software is your friend, right? I was talking through so many different things and codes and putting them over here in analytical memos. And my gosh, right? You don't want to be doing this on paper. You don't want to be doing this by hand. It's too complex, right? And there is technology that is your friend, right? So there are different tools. In Vivo is one of the most common. It's one that I've used quite regularly. This is going to help you put in your interviews, highlight these different coded segments, and then add your codes, and then it's going to do all the hard work of categorizing these things for you. It can help you with triangulation. It can look for overlaps. It can do, like visual mapping and word clouds, and it can even do some interesting statistical analyses that are appropriate for qualitative analysis. Very powerful tool. No, in vivo and max QDA are very similar, but they're steep learning curve. Okay, so if you ever have a chance within your learning journey to take training on in vivo or max QDA, it's free. I highly recommend you do it, especially if you're interested in this kind of work. I will not be able to give you like a full walkthrough here during this lecture or course. There's many YouTube videos specifically within this course, unfortunately, because they cost money and I can't get the license for everybody, but they're vital, right? And this is really going to help you do this systematic coding and keep that paper trail that I mentioned so that you're not, like solving a true crime mystery with strings and papers all over, no, we're not doing that, right? So it's important though, software cannot replace analytical judgment. This is difficult because AI will certainly try to do that in today's day and age, right? And there will be many tools that will tempt you and tell you that AI can do all these things for you, okay? Can AI be incredibly helpful in this process? Absolutely. Full disclosure, I use Notebook LM to do a lot of my thematic analysis and some of this more qualitative data analysis. I'll put in all of my interviews into Notebook LM that I have already coded, and I'll query it about different questions within the data to see if some of these things that I saw within my in vivo coding are actually showing up as consistent, right? So it is a powerful tool, but be careful, right? I don't know. This could, age poorly, and you may be watching this in 5 years' time, and now AI is, making emotional decisions or something, or taking these complex analytical judgments. I don't know, but right now, you are the best at this process. If you've been conducting this research, you are the expert, right? Don't rob yourself of that opportunity to apply your knowledge to this, right? This is the whole fun. This is the whole process. Don't just you know surplus this out to a computer to sort of interpret the lived experiences of a community that and you worked with that the AI has literally no connection to. It just seems icky. It doesn't seem very justice driven. Do in vivo and max QDA now start bringing in more AI tools? Yes. Are they useful? Some of them. Be careful, right? Just, follow the processes. There's many well-established, methodological processes for this to keep in mind. But again, and there's no substitute for interpretive decisions, pattern significance assessment, theoretical innovation. This requires human intellectual engagement, right? For now, the robots haven't replaced us. The clunkers have not replaced us yet, right? So use software as analytical infrastructure, as a powerful tool that's going to support your systematic, data collection, but don't think it's going to replace it altogether, right? It's going to organize your work, but your brain does the analysis, okay? Next, we're going to move from coding techniques to theoretical interpretation, turning that coded data into research findings that contribute to knowledge. Look, we've almost come full circle. It's incredible. But for now, just think about these things. Today we talked a lot about developing your analytical reasoning, not just mechanical categorization. So, in these sort of next steps, I want you to think about and just kind of review these things before we go into the next video. But, comparative case analysis across contexts, right? How could we, incorporate this as well? Temporal analysis of these justice pattern changes. Should we be looking for this in the data? How about scalar analysis from local to global justice claims, right? Integration of spatial and quantitative data, right? How can we keep, improving this analytical development, right? So that, if we only have access to our interview data, that's okay. We're going to do our best, right? But I put myself in the middle of this galaxy. How fun. But, if we can incorporate more interesting mixed data that's going to support and make a more rigorous study that's not going to add, and unnecessary layer of complexity, why not, right? So, got to think, though, about sample size requirements for pattern identification, data source diversification for comprehensive analysis. Are these too disparate? Can we actually make a claim or a connection here? Temporal scope for change analysis. You probably can't see change take place in 6 months, right? 1 year, 5 years, right? How can you observe this, right? It needs to be grounded. And comparative frameworks for generalizability claims are difficult in qualitative data because they are often very contextually specific to the given community that we're working with. So we have to think about that, right? Okay, these are some big ideas. We're going to unpack these in the next video. But thanks for your time and attention. I appreciate it.